Thank you so much. And I don't know if you saw, the book multiplied back there. There are more of them now. And I've never seen more than 2 in one place. It's very exciting. Thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to Falvey Library for having me, and to Becky, I saw you, and to Gina in particular for organizing my talk, and giving me this opportunity to discuss my new book. In a very unprofessional way, I'd love to just hold it up and say, isn't it pretty? I'm just kind of kidding. I could do that for half an hour. But instead of doing that, I'll try to be a little bit more professional, though I do first want to thank a couple people in here who have really, really helped this project to come to fruition, and it really didn't take very long, right? First, I need to thank my research assistants. Eli's right there. Steve Purcell, I'm not sure if he's here, and Grace O, who's not here. They really helped me throughout the project. I want to thank my whole department, who have been so wonderful, so admirably chaired by Dr. Evan Radcliffe. I could not have done this without the support of my department. And then I want to thank 2 people who are here especially, in addition to my friends who I saw came, and so many of my students. But I want to thank first my husband, who has lived with and breathed vagueness for our entire marriage, and whose investment shows in that he is still more eloquent at the 5-minute explanation of what this book is about than I am. And also to my mother, to whom, along with the memory of my father, this book is dedicated. To explain why Mom deserves this dedication, I will say one more thing about the cover. So Cambridge really let me design it, which was pretty cool. And I bought the cover image, for example, from Getty Images. It's an unknown photographer's shot of 1930s London. And then my cousin Rosemary and her colleague designed the cover, but we couldn't decide what color to make the spine. A very, very important decision. So my mom drove all the way down from New York, and I piled into the back of her station wagon. We went downtown to Philly. We walked from bookstore to bookstore looking at the spines of books. And we decided that green is an underused color for covers for modernism books. Any of you thinking about doing one in the future, red is overused. Red is the hot color. So, so thank you, Mom, for your hours of help and babysitting, and for having, as an architect, a much better design eye than I will ever have. Thank you. Today, I'm going to try to be very precise about a topic that makes it difficult, vagueness. I think my next book project, which I plan to be on T.S. Eliot and fiction, will aim to be very precise so that I don't have to deal with this fellow's problem. My talk today is going to be in 2 parts. The first is an overview of the book project in general, and then the second part is a case study on Henry James's short story, The Beast in the Jungle, and some pragmatic philosophy, so you can see how the book works in general, a little example of it. The germ, to use a favorite Jamesian term of my talk, is that the bewildering style of the later Henry James mirrors what his brother William James, the philosopher, called the reinstatement of the vague in philosophy. I will aim to explain that reinstatement of the vague and to emphasize the influence of the American pragmatists' vagueness on British modernist philosophy. First, just to situate it very broadly, my big argument is that modernist fiction, there we go, which is generally thought of as novels from the first half of the 20th century, is vague. Or, to be more specific, that questions about the possible precision of language, central to what we know of as the linguistic turn in philosophy, lead to much of what we recognize as modernist experimentation. Anyone who's a fan of literary modernism, or has been forced to become such a fan by being in one of my classes, knows that the recognizable setting, characters, plot, even the narrator's voice and the structure of the sentence, familiar to you from popular fiction that you might read, or from Victorian masters like Charles Dickens and George Eliot, something happened to this familiar style at the beginning of the 20th century. At worst, this characterization has led these literary modernist texts, such as the ones I focus upon, by Henry James, Woolf, and Joyce, to be characterized as obscure and hostile to the common reader. Hopefully, after we've taken a class, you don't feel that way anymore, but that they're very difficult to read. So why are they so difficult? What led to this sudden experimentation, and how should it best be characterized? When Virginia Woolf satirized, oh, and there's just a copy of the books the books that I sort of study. This was part of the first edition of the James, and that's the Virginia Woolf cover that her sister Vanessa, and of course, famous cover of Ulysses. When Virginia Woolf satirized what it was like to live in the modern era rather than in an earlier time period, she called the early 20th century an ambiguous and doubtful age. And here, take a quick second and look at these two juxtaposed images of Woolf to see what she might have meant. First, here she is as a girl next to her father, Leslie Stephen, the great eminent Victorian. He was the editor, he was both a philosopher and the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, where the lives of the great British men were chronicled. And here's a second, oh no, there's the second one, of Woolf. This is one of the few images she actually kind of liked. She hated images of herself, but this one she sort of liked, by Giselle Freund. And this one's from 1939. Just notice the change here. The difference between, of course, one is black and white and one is colored. But others changes in the appearance, Woolf's appearance, and the way that she seems to step out of being behind her father's shoulder and take on the camera lens itself. But then, of course, you don't exactly know what this glance means. What is she thinking? Anyway, with her transformation from a Victorian girlhood to a more modern adulthood in mind, look at what she wrote about the 20th century in her mock biography, Orlando. So she talks about the past, the time she remembered, and she said, "Sunsets were redder and more intense. Dawns were whiter and more auroral. Of our crepuscular," seems like shadowy, "half-lights and lingering twilights they knew nothing. The rain fell vehemently or not at all. The withered intricacies and ambiguities of our more gradual and doubtful age were unknown to them. Violence was all, the flower bloomed and faded, the sun rose and sank, the lover loved and went." She's being a little tongue-in-cheek, as Woolf often is. But the past for her, as she describes it, was a time of decisiveness, certainty, and action. The present, not so much. When Woolf sat down to write fiction, she felt that she had to take this change into account, these withered intricacies that were this current time. And she couldn't just continue with a plot that would be recognizable from A to Z, recognizable characters. Instead, she argued famously in what's been called her manifesto, modern novels, if one were free and could set down what one chose, there would be no plot, little probability, and a vague general confusion in which the clear-cut features of the tragic, the comic, the passionate, and the lyrical were dissolved beyond the possibility of separate recognition. What led to Woolf's sense that a vague general confusion was somehow truer to 20th century experience than the clear-cut features of tragedy or comedy? Why did it get so changed? And she changed this in a later draft, but that's the way it was in the earlier draft. When critics point to the rise of literary modernism, like Woolf's novels, or to modernism in the arts more generally, they often point to historical factors, and this should be familiar to you. Historical factors such as the explosion of urbanization and imperialism in the early 20th century and the consequent intermixing of cultures and of languages, the growth of newspapers, and their widespread reportage of national and international unrest brought home to the breakfast table, and the general disillusionment caused by the outbreak of World War I and other factors, that the century of progress envisioned by the Victorians was one great big lie. They felt they'd been lied to. While I do not disagree with any of these familiar reasons for why literary modernist texts became so experimental, let me add one more ingredient to the modernist recipe, which is a grain of sand. I don't know if it's hard for you to tell this, or is it a pile, is it a heap of sand? Actually, that's a big question. Let me explain. Ever since classical times, when abilities of Miletus, we're jumping back a long way now here to the 4th century, first, is it jumping around a lot?
Just flashing.
It's just flashing?
From time to time.
I don't think I'm doing it. Okay, first asserted his sorites paradox, and soros is heap in Greek. Terms with vague boundaries have been an object of philosophical debate. If you have a vague boundary. Here's Eubulides, what he said about the sorites paradox. And if you start thinking about this a lot, it drives you kind of crazy. He said, "I say, tell me, do you think a single grain of wheat is a heap? Thereupon you say no. Then I say, what do you say about 2 grains? For it is my purpose to ask you this question in succession. And if you do not admit that 2 grains are a heap, then I shall ask you about 3 grains. Then I shall proceed to interrogate you further with respect to 4 grains. You get the idea. 5, 6, 7, 8. And you will assuredly say that none of these make a heap. The boundary between several grains of sand and a heap, or a man with a little hair and a bald man, appears unstable. I used to use the bald man paradox, and I realized it was a much more sensitive subject than I knew. So I'm sticking with sand nowadays, sand. Recent theorists of vagueness continue to wrestle with this problem, to such an extent that one critic exclaimed, Eubulides himself can hardly have foreseen that his modest heap of grain would grow to menace Olympus and undermine the foundations of logic. Why does this simple paradox undermine or menace logic? As Rosanna Keefe in Theories of Vagueness explains, if you remove a single grain of sand from a heap, you surely still have a heap. But if you take a heap and remove grains one by one, you can apply that principle at each stage, which will commit you to counting even the solitary final grain as a heap, and that is the Sorites paradox, right? That you just have that one grain and then you have a heap. Bertrand Russell, his example used to be a corpse. He would talk about, it was particularly macabre, but I thought it went well for Russell, that when was a dead body no longer that person's name? How much did it have to decompose, doctor friends out there, until it was no longer recognizable of the name that you thought it was? Okay, logicians emphasize that terms such as heap and corpse and tall, or even child or belief, have boundaries that are fuzzy, so that when logic is applied to define them, although the premises continue to be plausible, you end up with the conclusion which is totally absurd. A heap, there is at some point one single grain does not equal a heap. Vague boundaries appear to undermine the principle of bivalence. Either something is or is not true, therefore shaking the foundations of classical logic. What does this have to do with modernism? I'll get you there, I promise. Though in classical times, paradoxes like the Sorites were actually used to test scholars' dialectical skills. And the heap was actually such a famous paradox that the average reader was supposed to note allusions to heaps in literature. Then you were supposed to sort of know, oh, that's a philosophical question I'm being asked. It was not until the end of the 19th century, with the origins of the analytic tradition, that vagueness resurfaced as a key concept. And then from the late 19th to the early 20th century, the problem of vagueness in language became a central subject of debate in pragmatism and in the philosophy of language. Suddenly, everyone was talking about vagueness, and that's one of the things that my book really talks about. Why were philosophers giving speeches about it? Why were fiction writers talking about it? And I should say that it's still a very hot topic in analytic philosophy today. If you Google vagueness, it's all over the place. That's why there are books like Rosanna Keefe's called Theories of Vagueness. Okay, but back in the day, there were sort of 2 general camps in the beginning of the 20th century towards this problem of vagueness. On the one hand, and these are sort of my enemies or straw men, and I've been careful to try to nuance that over the years. But on the one hand were the philosophers clinging to an ideal of precision, what we should call the analytic tradition. For example, ideal language theorists like Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege devised new formal languages and symbolic systems. I know, this is mean that I made him look like this. He often looks much better. But I thought since I was putting him up as a straw man. They devised new formal languages and symbolic systems in order to avoid the irregular qualities of ordinary language. Russell even delivered a talk called Vagueness in 1922, where he pretended in front of an audience to be sad that he had to talk in English. He wanted instead to use symbolic notations, but he blamed it on their ancestors for not being interested enough in logic and in mathematics. So he was stuck having to use this vague, ordinary language, English. For Russell, vagueness was merely a linguistic quibble. And maybe a couple of you are thinking, like, who cares? It doesn't really make a difference. It's just a linguistic quibble. For him, the world itself was solid and real and not abstract, and it was language which, and also he moved that to photography, any kind of representational system he thought was the problem. And so you could always somehow make a more and more precise system, and that was his dream. And he wasn't alone in that. He influenced a lot of people. Logical positivism, with its faith in science and in empiricism, similarly extolled precision. Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus is often read as setting out the limits of logical precision. And C.K. and Ogden and I.A. Richards' work on basic English which I'm sort of obsessed with. It's this very odd language that was created, an international auxiliary language at the beginning of the 20th century, which only had 850 words, mostly nouns and simple verbs. And it was this desire to take the sprawling mess which was language and somehow pin it down and make it much more specific, almost like mathematics, if mathematics could be made specific. And here's this really bizarre text where Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which is possibly the messiest, most bizarre text written in its own language, Joyce organized for it to be translated into basic English because he really wanted to hear what it would sound like. So you change from something that sounds very Joycean, a mixture of languages, of French and English, and references to the Bible, but you're not sure what's exactly going on. Wait till the honeying of the loon, love, die, Eve, little Eve, die. And then when that was translated into basic English, it sounded like, do not go till the moon is up, love. She's dead, little Eve, she's dead. We want to have an album called Little Eve, She's Dead. You can see how that's a very different kind of text when it's translated from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake into this very precise language that they dreamed of. So there was sort of a whole trend of trying to pin down and make language more specific than it ever had been, or to move away from language. On the other hand, oh, no, don't look at that. On the other hand, pragmatists like Charles Sanders Peirce, who I'm going to talk more about later, and William James, while they understood what those philosophers were up to who were trying to make language specific, they thought their efforts were futile. And therefore they said, let's enlist vagueness as a tool instead. Both Peirce and William James recommend vagueness as a necessary condition for an exploration of new truths. And I'll talk more about pragmatism and vagueness in a moment. The positive reevaluation of vagueness culminated in Wittgenstein's praise of the blur in philosophical investigations, where if you know about Wittgenstein's language games, he says it doesn't matter that you can't pin it down, right? It's fine. Language works the way it is. His famous example is the person who points to a space in a square and says, go stand roughly over there. Everyone knows where you mean. It doesn't matter that it's not a very specific definition. For Stanley Cavell and the ordinary language philosophers in Wittgenstein's wake, the vagueness of language is a given, and it is philosophy's duty to demonstrate how ordinary usage acts pragmatically in order to explain, and this is from Cavell, how the language we traverse every day can contain undiscovered treasure. That language itself, something about the vagueness of it is actually very beautiful and very fecund, and there's no need for us to try to be pinning it down. So why does this philosophical argument matter for literary modernism? In my book, I pair in every chapter a philosopher with a novelist, and I show that writers like James, Woolf, and Joyce, along with a lot of the others, I'll say Conrad, Forster, Gertrude Stein, knew about the debates on linguistic precision occurring in philosophy. And I argue that the novelists were self-consciously or unconsciously assimilating these contemporary philosophical questions into their novels. I propose that the vagueness of modernist fiction is both stylistic, stretching from Henry James's long, long sentences, which you're probably familiar with, to Woolf's dissolution of direct discourse, to Joyce's verbal coinages in Finnegan's Wake, and also thematic, stretching from James's ineffable secrets, to Woolf's impressionistic renderings of subjectivity, to the climactic moment when Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom meet in Ulysses, and you're not exactly sure what happened at that meeting. What were the ramifications of it? While being vague carries different weight in each of these cases, what is consistent is the sense that the precision that the modern novelist attributed to literary realism was stridently under attack, and that what literary realism posited as firm and static becomes in the modernist world fuzzy and subject to perception. I examine both the literary modernist tendency to ridicule philosophy in the various novels. They tend to sort of mock philosophers who appear, and its institutions, its figureheads, and its history, but then they also absorb these questions about linguistic analysis in both theme and style. To just give one very obvious example, Into the Lighthouse, Woolf's character of Mr. Ramsay, a philosopher who's obsessed with getting to the letter Q, seems a figure of fun, but at the same time, the whole book is sort of about how precise a symbol can the lighthouse be, and how can we be precise in our language about describing that symbol. So she's both mocking the figure and at the same time using some of his questions. My book ends up arguing one central point, I've decided, which actually ended up being in a footnote, that modernist that modernist fiction writers were as fascinated by the problems that vague language held for literary realism as philosophers were interested in the problem of vagueness for philosophical realism in the early 20th century. So that embracing a modernist blur rebuffs in a parallel movement both Arnold Bennett, who's a Victorian realist, his arguments about literary realism, and Russell's philosophical realism. They're both reacting against these kinds of two different notions of realism, but simultaneously. I don't have time to talk about this side of it, but I just wanted you to know that there's also a whole literary precise movements, and that's where basic English comes in, imagism, the new criticism, T.S. Eliot and the objective correlative. I like this image of Eliot carefully mapping out one of his plays. This is sort of leaning towards the precise side of language. Okay, but now I'll do a little case study for you of how the book works, if that's the overall argument. I'm going to ask you to take with me a short leap back in time and across the Atlantic as I turn to Henry James, William James, and Charles Peirce. I added this photograph of the James brothers. It was taken in England, and I thought it made a nice visual corollary to the movement of my argument, because I'm switching to discuss the James brothers, but I'm still interested in their influence in England and in British literature, both of the philosopher and of the fiction writer. I also like how Henry James kind of looks like the dandy and is looking, whereas William James is looking quite austere as the philosopher here, looking off to the side. In particular, I aim to demonstrate how understanding vagueness is going to change your understanding of the story, The Beast in the Jungle. Hopefully you know The Beast in the Jungle. If not, I'm going to tell you what happens. Henry James's late story about a guy named John Marcher, a rather typical Jamesian sensitive bachelor who feels he is awaiting some great event, what he imagines is the pouncing of a beast in the jungle, but who fears in the end that nothing will happen. He waits and waits and waits, and in the end he fears that actually his special fate was to be the man to whom nothing ever happens. And that was maybe the beast for him. I'm sorry to give away the ending for those of you who haven't read the story, but basically Marcher does wait around for something to happen with his friend May until May finally dies. And then at her graveside, he feels that the beast finally pounces. There's been all sorts of analysis of this story, what it means. Is it an allegory? Is it a parable? What does it stand for? Today, I'm going to posit a new source for Marcher's beast. The Anxiety of Charles Peirce. And I have an article on this topic, who was their friend. He was their main companion during the winter of 1875 for Henry James, and Charles Peirce is also the person who coined the term pragmatism. Here he is. I will also aim to show how the story is a microcosm of what F.R. Leavis in the great tradition bemoaned as the inveterate indirectness of the later James. I hope my reading will gesture towards why a knowledge of vagueness is important in our approach to much modern fiction, just as knowledge of Henry James's writing importantly influenced the later fictions of Woolf and of Joyce. So first, if you would, listen to this quotation, which may sound like a synopsis of the story that I just told you, but is actually from How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Steve, I gave you a shout out as my research assistant. Thank you. For those of you who know the story, it sounds like a synopsis. I hate this flashing. Maybe there's something vague about it. It's keeping you on your toes. But it's actually from How to Make Our Ideas, which is Charles Peirce's groundbreaking article that William James later called the birth certificate of pragmatism. Peirce was a childhood friend of the James brothers, one of the long-headed youths whom Henry James felt free to caricature as one of William's philosophical company. When Henry James talked about William and his friends who would sit around philosophizing in Cambridge, he said about them, "It gives me a headache merely to know about them." He wrote his brother that in a letter. Louis Menand's well-known book, The Metaphysical Club, is about this group. Peirce's 1848 article that this quotation stems from aimed to demolish both imprecision and the notion of grand ideas, using what would later be called the pragmatic method. So here's where he sets out the pragmatic method, and he also tries to say imprecision is a terrible idea. He sets out part of the pragmatic method. He says, our idea of anything is our idea of its sensible effects. But he also includes this excerpted lesson from an old German story. And think of the beast in the jungle as I read this, and I have to read all of this. It is terrible to see how a single unclear idea, a single formula without meaning, lurking in a young man's head, will sometimes act like an obstruction of inert matter in the brain, hindering the nutrition of the brain and condemning its victim to pine away in the fullness of his intellectual vigor and in the midst of intellectual plenty. Many a man has cherished for years some vague shadow of an idea, too meaningless to be positively false. He has nevertheless passionately loved it, has made it his companion by day and by night, and has given to it his strength and his life. Until it he's lived for it, leaving all occupations, boy, it really goes badly. Live with and for it until it has become, as it were, flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, and then he has waked up some morning to find it gone, clean vanished away, like the beautiful Melusina of the fable, and the essence of his life gone with it. I have myself known such a man. So that's an anecdote that was appended to a philosophical essay. Yes. The story of the fled Melusina, a half-woman, half-serpent who gives birth to monsters, acts ostensibly as a warning against the danger inherent in vague ideas. A vague shadow of an idea can sap the lifeblood of a young person, and therefore Peirce warns we must strive to be clear. And actually, after writing this, he wrote his essay on vagueness. But Peirce's anecdote did more than further his argument. It was an autobiographical aside, and so personal, in fact, that he ordered this passage to be deleted in all future printings of his essay. So you can't really find this in the normal How to Make Our Ideas Clear, which is in all the pragmatism handbooks. But you have to look elsewhere, and then you find this is attached to the end of it. Melusina was not just an allusion to a mythological figure, it was also a reference to the middle name of Peirce's wife, Harriet Melusina Fay. Since his school days, Peirce's friend, whom he had called Zena, had been his constant companion, and even the scribe for his fervent aspirations. A lot of Peirce's early writings are in her handwriting. Under the title Theories of C.S. Peirce, she had copied out his ambitious declaration. This is what Peirce said. My life is built upon a theory, and if this theory turns out false, my life will turn out a failure. And just in proportion as my theory is false, my life is a failure. Students, don't feel that way. Just going to throw that one out there. You can always revise your theory, right? But Peirce didn't feel that way. He thought his life would be a failure if this theory was wrong. By the mid-1870s, Peirce was finally elucidating his theory in his articles, giving birth to pragmatism. However, Melusina herself had indeed clean vanished away, leaving Peirce in Paris to what his friend Henry James called a very lonely and dreary existence. Peirce's inclusion of this anecdote about his loneliness, and I find the line very poignant, I have myself known such a man, reveals his anger, even as it's sad. Melusina is both a monster and beautiful, and with her disappearance, Peirce has lost the essence of his life. The personal allusion also highlights the anxiety in the young Peirce's writing. What if his theories came to nothing, remaining merely vague, and he lost his whole life and his wife to this misguided dedication? And how ironic would that be, given that the idea itself focused on vagueness and aimed to explode the fallacy of grand ideas? That irony, I want to argue, wasn't lost on his main companion during the winter of 1875, Henry James. After Melusina had left Peirce, Peirce's philosophical idea had become his chief companion, so that James asserted, I did what I could to give him society. And in the letters going back and forth between Henry and William James, you see Henry talking about him and saying, you know, I tried to hang out with him, but I'll give you a couple more of this. Throughout James's tale, written by Henry James later, but when the James brothers were corresponding about Peirce's collapsing career, John Marcher and his friend May Bartram, waiting with him, await the fulfillment of a special destiny figured as the beast, but nothing occurs. They sit around waiting. Marcher's culminating realization after May's death is that love for her would have allowed him to baffle his doom. The escape would have been to love her. Then he would have lived, James writes. And yet this understanding seems to many readers, and to Marcher himself, an abject anticlimax. We could all have seen this coming. They've been sitting there together for pages and pages. If it was to love her, why didn't that happen? As Marcher and May wait, what they do together is attempt to describe the lurking beast. They call it a catastrophe, a long riddle, a superstition, a mysterious fate, a secret, although they fail to come up with a single precise definition. May offers herself to him once, all expectant, assuring him it's never too late, may be her attempt to bridge the unspoken. That's what James says. It's bridging the explosion. But all he replies to her is, wait, what do you say? Physical human contact does not fulfill the need Marcher has to say what the beast might be. What stymies Marcher is that he can't speak his doom precisely. He says, doesn't the man of courage know what he's afraid of or not afraid of? I don't know that. I don't focus it. I can't name it. Merely bantering about with the metaphor of the beast does not satisfy him. When May tries to reassure him that his experience has come and that he has survived, he immediately asks her, quote, was it a positive, definite occurrence with a name and a date? But May merely leaves him too hopelessly out at sea by answering, positive and definite, but I don't know the name. Marcher's frustration, fulfilling Peirce's anxiety in how to make our ideas clear, is due to his inability to clearly name his beast. Just as Peirce feared that that vague shadow of an idea, too meaningless to be positively false, could sap a young person's lifeblood, so also Marcher's life, dedicated to his beast, seems meaningless when the beast fails to pounce during May's lifetime. May, like Xena, disappears, and yet Marcher is merely left with her grave and the great vagueness. When Marcher refers to the beast as the great vagueness in the story, James's word choice is very pointed in terms of Peirce's writings. So I don't think he calls it the great vagueness by chance. He's thinking about Peirce and Peirce's writings that he knew about. In vagueness studies in philosophy, Peirce is often pointed to as the first rigorous theorist of vagueness. In fact, in a lot of the dictionaries, he comes first. For Peirce, in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, vagueness is an abject fault. Since the very first lesson we have a right to demand that logic shall teach us is how to make our ideas clear. Peirce's interest in vagueness notably influenced William James, the pragmatist in his wake, and also Wittgenstein. They all point back to Peirce, Peircean semiotics, but also to this interest in vagueness. And here I want to be clear because it's a little bit complicated. Although Peirce coined the term pragmatism and was interested in vagueness, his approach to vagueness actually often plants him more firmly in Russell's analytic camp that I described earlier than in that of the pragmatist William James, because he believed vagueness was only a step on the way to something precise. In his search for truth, you wanted to eliminate vagueness. Like Russell, he believed logical approaches to language and scientific analysis were the key tools for philosophy. So it was okay to be vague at the beginning, but at the end you wanted to be certain. Peirce argued that, quote, logicians have too much neglected the study of vagueness. However, he had worked out the logic of vagueness with something like completeness. Under the heading of vague in the 1902 Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology, Peirce defined vagueness as due to an indeterminate habit of language, resulting from incomplete self-consciousness, a failing on a part of the thinker, who did not bother to press himself with essential questions. Peirce, in contrast, I want to argue, to the James brothers, does not allow that the world itself might be vague, but insists that indeterminacy stems from a speaker's inconsistent relationship to language. Henry James's response to the sad irony of Peirce's self-fulfilling prophecy of failure is dramatized in The Beast in the Jungle. So that's what I'm adding to the conversation. I see this anxiety from Peirce as central to the story. With Peirce in mind, James's story presents, I'll give you part of the story. With Peirce in mind, James's story presents a less precise moral than is often attributed to the tale. And what usually people say is, Marcher is a self-consumed man who should have appreciated his selfless companion's love. So you read the story and you think, boy, that guy was a jerk. Why didn't he realize that that woman loved him all along? But I think that knowing about Peirce, it's a little bit different, one of the morals of the story. At the end, fearing that his life was the most grotesque of failures, in facing his fellow mourners' deep ravage, Marcher has a famous epiphany at the graveside. He says he had seen outside of his life, not learned it within, the way a woman was mourned when she had been loved for herself. But is this equation of a life lived without love really the measurement of the abyss, or really the sounding of the depths? Those are two Jamesian metaphors for it. Marcher asserts that the beast had lurked indeed, and the beast at its hour had sprung. It had sprung in the twilight of the cold April morning when he had refused May's love. Yet the metaphorical beast, animated in Marcher's hallucination, still rises up for a leap to settle him at the end of the story. Marcher can't control his knowledge. Rather, he still thinks in terms of this metaphor, as if his definition is somehow not satisfactory, though he tries to fix and hold it. Yet, by limiting Marcher's realization to his own point of view, James highlights the pathos of Marcher's situation, allowing for the possibility that Marcher is just wrong. He thinks that the beast has sprung, but it hasn't. Marcher, I want to argue, never succeeds in getting to the root of his sensation, and the beast still lacks definition, even as Marcher flings himself face down on the tomb. James famously calls the story a great negative adventure in the preface, and that allows for the possibility that even the epiphany at the end is just negative, is meaningless. All he has is a meaningless epiphany. James's story presents a parody of Peirce's philosophy that everything meaningful can be precisely expressed. That's what I'm arguing. The man obsessed with a theory, seeing that his time is running out for definition, forces an interpretation onto his great vagueness and is then overwhelmed by the unsatisfactory personification of the metaphor itself. The great vagueness can't be distilled into love for May. Not even, as Eve Sedgwick famously argues, is it equivalent to unknowable desire. Again, that's a little bit too specific for what vagueness is. The great vagueness, I want to argue, is a characteristic of late language itself, a powerful, irreducible characteristic, and James's tale is as much a pragmatist parable as it is a story about resisting language's vagueness. It is a pragmatist parable because Marcher, whose beast figures as his great ideal, wastes away his life awaiting a certain precise truth, therefore missing the multiple truths, the effects of his beast on his life and on May's. It's a meta-linguistic tale about the vagueness of language because John Marcher's search for meaning results in a proliferation of metaphors, the beast, the trick, the hunt, none of which precisely correlate to this sense of doom. Marcher's sense of failure stems from being unsatisfied with an unnameable fate. He wishes, like Peirce, to eliminate vagueness, to get to the concrete fact of the matter, rather than to exult in the metaphors he creates. I feel like I should be welcoming some of these tours in. Come, join us at Villanova. He wishes, like Peirce, to eliminate vagueness, to get to the concrete fact of the matter, rather than to exalt in the metaphors he creates. Therefore, he resists the path of the writer, like Henry James. Marcher is not a pragmatist comfortable with vague definitions. He, like Peirce and like Russell, seeks a precise truth with a precise meaning. James's style in general, particularly that of the major phase, is often criticized for a parallel stylistic vagueness. And you can perhaps observe this in the quotation from the story. I can pick any sentence up there, but how about, he had never at any stage of his queer consciousness admitted the whisper of such a correction. He had never till within these last few months been so false to his convictions as to not hold that, you get the idea. It's very often hard to find what the noun is, what the verb is. There are a lot of abstract nouns, and James is often criticized for this in the later phase. William James, for example, very frustrated with this vague style of the later James, expresses a general theme. And here's a quotation, and I put this one up here for Kamran. No offense, bud. He says about him, "I don't enjoy the kind of problem and the method of narration by interminable elaboration of suggested reference. I don't know what else to call it, but you know what I mean. Won't you, just to please, brother, sit down and write a new book? With no twilight or mustiness in the plot, with great vigor and decisiveness in the action, no fencing in the dialogue, no psychological commentaries, and absolute straightness in style. Publish it in my name, I will acknowledge it and give you half the proceeds." John Marcher's inability to express his sense of doom in any manner but repeated metaphor parallels Henry James's own later style of interminable elaboration of suggested reference that William James laments. A story with absolute straightness in style is exactly what Marcher seeks in the explanation of the beast, a positive, definite occurrence with a name and a date. But for Henry James, the certain indirect and oblique presentation is perhaps the only way to probe this great vagueness. Marcher's desire to name the beast works against James's declared confidence in the positive saving virtue of vagueness. And even William James asserted that in later works like The Beast in the Jungle, that it achieved a paradoxical success in this unheard of method. Perhaps that's because William James, too, even if he didn't want it in the fiction that he was reading, acknowledged the vagueness of experience. He resoundingly argued in the Principles of Psychology for this reinstatement of the vague, to its proper place in our mental life. And according to William James, logical terms were always kind of a fiction. They merely feigned static positions, and James preferred ordinary language, whose vagueness mirrored that of a world in flux. James's probably most famous coinage of the term the stream of consciousness mines the Sorites paradox, noting that it would be impossible to divide a river into parts, such as pails full, spoons full, quarts full, barrels full, etc. Because for William James, and he's sounding like a vagueness theorist here, the borders of subjective life are themselves vague. For William James, the vagueness of fixed truths is a key to the pragmatic method. There are not black and white correct meanings, but as James noted, the truth is what works. Henry James's stylistic revolution in fiction mirrors William's innovations in philosophy. And what Ian Watt calls James's verbal idiosyncrasies similarly underscore relation and change rather than any kind of fixed or precise meaning. Though his contemporary critics often chastised Henry James for the inadequacy of his stories and for the long stretches of obscure dialogue and confusing revelations, a criticism which I still hear 100 years later by my students when they have to read the later Henry James in class, like William, Henry did not want to follow received traditions if they failed to capture the vagueness of consciousness and experience. When Henry James declared himself in his career the novelist of the future, he heralds this investment in the vagueness of psychological complexity, abstract dialogue, and indeterminate plot and morality, qualities that influence the modernists in his wake, such as Woolf and Joyce. And there's just one more paragraph, and I have to do it for Charles Peirce's sake, as if he cares, but you know what I mean. William James's reinstatement of the vague stems from his pragmatism, which in turn is indebted to Charles Peirce. Charles Peirce himself became so disenchanted with William's vague writings. Remember, because Peirce thought vagueness was just one step along the way towards precision. And he became so disenchanted with the way William James was talking about pragmatism and the lack of scientific terminology that he created his own new version of pragmatism. He called it pragmaticism, a term he claimed was certainly ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. And I'll notice there are not any classes on pragmaticism here at Villanova. Nonetheless, Peirce, who figured as the germ of the disappointed genius for Henry James's The Beast in the Jungle, ironically forged the pragmatic theory that fostered William James's reinstatement of the vague. Henry James's praise of William's pragmatism, therefore, applies to Charles Peirce as well. Henry wrote to William, "I was lost in the wonder of the extent to which all of my life I have unconsciously pragmatized." He wrote in a letter, "You are immensely and universally right." Henry James will not slay vagueness as Peirce or Marcher or Russell would like to do. The James brothers' insistence upon the fecundity of vague language rings out in the face of what Russell calls scientific truthfulness. So in place of Russell's scientific truthfulness, Henry James writes, "No, no, no, I reach beyond this laboratory brain." Thank you. I know that some people had at 3 o'clock or had to go right away, so I totally understand if you need to sneak out. But I'm happy to take any questions about the project. Ooh, Heather's already gone. Jeez Louise, I'm ready.
By the time you get to postmodern theory, this kind of indeterminacy winds up having all kinds of political implications, right? So, both for the theorists, but then for the writers who adopt vague or indeterminate techniques, because then the writer is sort of empowering the reader to project different kinds of meanings into the text, and it also suggests nuance and variety of possible meanings that can be brought to things from a worldview or whatever. Is there a politics in vagueness in this whole concept?
I argue that there is. I actually cut it out of the talk, but there's a way in which I think in the first chapter on the James brothers, that there's a way in which arguing for the vagueness of experience is a very kind of American, trying to shake up class systems. And then when you get to Woolf, I think it's a very gendered, maybe already queer from James phenomenon. So Woolf, vagueness is always gendered feminine. She talks about the vagueness of language, and for her that's a positive thing of Dear Mother English. And then for Joyce as well, then I think it plays into certain kinds of Irish messing with both Finnegan's Wake, where you're seeing all these languages combined. So I definitely think there's a sort of anti-nationalist maybe movement there. So yeah, I think there is a politics in, and it's, I don't know if it's fair. It's often the way the modernists parody Victorian certainties rather than that Victorians were certain about these categories. But I think that certainly there is. Ready for another question?
I love hearing about Charles Summers first. Congratulations, it's fantastic with your work. My question is about Peirce and his idea on abduction. He says that the logic of abduction is the logic of guesswork and how humans guess remarkably well. Is it fair to say that abduction is something like hypothesis, that's something about vagueness, that we have to be speculative and guesswork is vague? And if so, does that mean it's more than just a step in finding the progression towards truth, but it's really the large middle way that most of us sort of muddle through life in?
Yeah, I have two things to say that. First of all, yes, I agree with you that it's more than a step, it's part of the process, which you need. The other thing I would say is that the Peirce that I'm talking about is an earlier Peirce. This is where he's really formulating his ideas, and that I think you could make arguments for the later Peirce being more of a... He's such a complicated figure, though, because of his combination of Christianity and also with scientific certainty. So I find him, and his semiotics, he's definitely... more so than some of my other figures, he kind of bridges a lot of the different gaps. But I think abduction definitely has more vagueness in it. I put newspapers in for you. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Eliot, because you didn't really get a chance to, about how Eliot figures into the project. And I know you're interested in Eliot for the future too, so there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was fun about this project, and actually last week I got to talk about this at Penn, and so I didn't talk about this at all here, is that when I got to the conclusion of it, there was a nice narrative arc in terms of the fact that T.S. Eliot's role in it, Eliot is both a critic of modernism and also, of course, a modernist writer. And his criticism, which is often sort of thought of as the birthplace of new criticism and is much more specific, it was very useful as a kind of umbrella to think about changes in philosophy in the period, and also why we've sort of misunderstood the role of vagueness in this time period up to now, because Eliot was so hugely influential as a critic, and as a critic who kind of wanted to eradicate vagueness, at least for the most important statements that he made, his early statements. So, for example, in Hamlet and His Problems, where he coins the term the objective correlative, and he argues for a kind of one-to-one correlation between emotion and character in that essay, I think he's actually at that point mimicking Bertrand Russell in his arguments for a one-to-one representational quality of language. So I think that Eliot's influential statements about literary criticism have often been interested in getting rid of vagueness altogether. So that when I got to write the conclusion of the project, it was very nice because I could think about the ways, it sort of let me step back and have a meta approach to why I was interested in this project, why it seemed like vagueness hadn't been studied, what Eliot's influence on all of that had been, and how we could rethink about Eliot in relationship, because Eliot's a philosopher and a critic, so how we could think about Eliot and the new criticism and what its relationship to precision was. So that was sort of the role of Eliot. The other part that I cut out of the talk at the end was all about how the new criticism is so invested in precision and in understanding symbols. I'm thinking about Empson's text, William Empson's text, 7 Types of Ambiguity, where he sort of goes through the different kinds of ambiguity and he explains it, and then he criticizes vagueness as a sort of weak kind of ambiguity that doesn't have alternatives. So if ambiguity is like that chair is either a chair or it's a piece of wood, vagueness, you're not exactly sure what the meaning of that is. It could be a lot of different things at the same time. In the very end part of the book, I also get to talk about the ramifications of new criticism on current approaches of literary criticism, say the digital humanities and affect theory and things like that. So I talked about the influence of taking hard-headed scientific approaches to literature, like Russell and people like that had, and how maybe if you're interested in vagueness and fuzzy studies, you might take a different approach. So that's the conclusion. Any other vague or precise questions? Heather's got another one. I'm ready.
What is the etymology of vague? How long has that word been around?
Oh, it's in the book.
I'll just look at the book.
Just look in the book. I know I talk about waves and vague, vaguelist, wandering, meandering. I think that's where it comes from, early French, but don't quote me on that. It is in the very beginning. But I think that actually the French meaning of wave is very interesting for a lot of these writers. And you think of water metaphors in a lot of the texts, especially in James in The Ambassadors, when he talks about vagueness, he knowingly is playing with a pun on water and waves all the time, and wolf and the waves.
Anybody else?
I'm just curious, you mentioned when Joyce used other languages and studied the Nazi languages, I was just curious about, I suppose the vagueness of using perhaps French or Latin in Ulysses, if you were to teach that would that make the text more or less vague as opposed to an English reader?
Having all these different languages present.
Yeah. Would that be the intention, or would that just simply be assuming that the reader knows the languages already?
That's a good question. And Eliot works the same way by having all these different languages that make the reading experience. I guess it depends upon the reader who's actually reading it. That's why Joyce is such an interesting character for this, because to a certain extent, sometimes I think Joyce really wanted to adopt Flaubert's idea of the mot juste, or the precise word, and he would take it from whatever language was there so it might be Joyce's effort to be more precise, but at some point I think he kind of threw up his hands and went for fingertip. And was happy to have language do what it wanted to do and to be subsumed to water. So does that help?
Yes.
Anything else? Okay, well, you don't have to rush off and buy $95 copies of the book, but they are back there. And wait, there was something else I was supposed to. Oh, haha, I didn't forget. Sign up for the Abbey Theatre Fellowship. We have an informational session, and there's a literary festival event on Thursday night. I don't think I forgot.
Bruce Smith.
Downstairs. Bruce Smith.
I'm right? Literary Festival Thursday night?
Yes.
Oh, Bruce Smith. I'm sorry, Bruce Smith will be here for Literary Festival Thursday night. And downstairs in Speaker's Corner at 7 o'clock, and he too will have books. And thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.